So we're going to move into the next part of this unit, which is essentially what is going on at the cell body part of the neuron. So hopefully at this point you have a pretty good understanding of what's happening in the axon. And one of the things I kept bringing up is this idea that you have to think of the neuron as really two components. There's the receiving end and then there's the output side, right? So the output side is what we've been talking about. The information travels down the axon and then it gets to the end of the axon and it jumps to either another neuron or it goes to a muscle or a gland and it elicits some kind of response. Those are called effectors. Now, I haven't really talked about at this point what's happening at the dendrite side of things to cause that action potential. So that's what we're going to get into now. And we're going to start off with the synapse. And this should sound very familiar to you because we've already talked about this when we got through the muscle unit. There's something called the neuromuscular junction, which is when the motor neuron synapses with a muscle and then it causes acetylcholine to cross that synapse and it triggers that muscle to contract. Well, that is exactly what happens with a neuron as well. The difference is in this scenario, it's a neuron and then another neuron. So instead of it going to a muscle or a gland in this case, or in some cases I should say, in this case we're talking about a neuron communicating with another neuron. So this is going to happen in the central nervous system. So let's talk about what happens. And again, a lot of this should sound familiar to you because we talked about this with the muscles. So what we have here in this image is we have an axon of one neuron and it is synapsing with the dendrite of another neuron. So this neuron is talking to this neuron. So let's talk about how that occurs. And just a couple things I want to point out to you is you might remember this term synapse, right? And that's what we have here. The synapse is the space. And what this does is it allows for the neurotransmitter to cross and then stimulate or inhibit the neuron that's next to it. And we're going to talk about this whole idea of exciting versus inhibiting as we go through this. And again, remember, there's the folds here. And again, those folds are to allow for more surface area, which is what's going to give the ability to have a quicker response between a neuron and another neuron. So let's go through what's actually happening. So the action potential occurs down the axon, and then when it gets to the end of the axon, it triggers the next step of this process, which is the synaptic knob becoming much more permeable to calcium. That's right, we're talking about calcium again. I keep bringing up how important calcium is to the human body and living things in general, and this is just another great example. So calcium, it gets absorbed by our digestive tract, and we need vitamin D for that, right? And then what ends up happening is we store it in our bones, but it gives our bones the rigidity to hold up our bodies. Also, we talked about calcium with the muscle unit. Calcium is what connects to troponin, which causes tropomyosin to move out of the way. So obviously calcium is important for a muscle contraction. And now here we have it again. Calcium is really important in this process. At the end of the axon, there's a large concentration of calcium channels. And these calcium channels are also voltage gated. So when that action potential travels down to the end of the axon here, where we have the synaptic bulb, that's where the neurotransmitter is being stored. It is going to trigger the calcium channels to open. Calcium will flood in, and then when calcium floods in, this is what causes the neuron to release the neurotransmitter. So there's these little vesicles, vesicles that are at the end of the presynaptic neuron. They have the neurotransmitter, and then there's a reaction that occurs. It's still not very well understood exactly what happens. I've talked to some of my friends who are actually neuroscience professors, so luckily I have that connection in some respects, and there's some theories on it, but there's still not a definite answer as to what calcium actually is doing to trigger that response. So if you're bored, look it up. There are a lot of theories with a lot of evidence, but nothing's definite. But basically what ends up happening is this triggers these vesicles to then fuse with the membrane, and then the neurotransmitter is released into the synapse. That neurotransmitter is going to cross the synapse, and then it's going to open up channels on the postsynaptic neuron, and that is going to either cause an excitatory or inhibitory response, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Excitatory is going to trigger that neuron to fire off. Inhibitory is actually going to prevent it from firing off. But either way, that's how these neurons communicate with each other. This just shows you an image of the presynaptic neuron. The action potential will travel down the axon, get to the end, cause that calcium to influx, and then that would trigger the postsynaptic neuron to either be inhibited or excited, and then the information is going to travel down that, and eventually that will synapse with another neuron. I'm going to finish up here by just talking a little bit about something called these neurotransmitters. And we're not going to go into great detail on this just because of time's sake, but I do want to talk a little bit about neurotransmitters and just talk about some of the more common ones. So neurotransmitters are chemicals that are produced by neurons, and that is what allows neurons to communicate with each other. It's the chemical part of our nervous system. The electrical part is the action potential, but the chemical part is what we're going to consider the synaptic potential. And we're going to talk more about that in another lecture. But let's get into what actually is doing the communication. There are these little molecules called neurotransmitters, and we make about 30 of them. And there's going to be two types. They're either going to be excitatory or they're going to be inhibitory. One, excitatory makes it easier for an action potential to occur, and inhibitory makes it more difficult. And I'm going to explain that better in another lecture in this unit when I talk about, okay, what's an excitatory versus inhibitory. But for right now, just understand that there's going to be either an excitatory neurotransmitter, and that's going to make a neuron fire off, and there's going to be an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and that's going to prevent a neuron from firing off. And we always have both being used all the time, and it's a little bit of like a tug of war as to which one is going to have more of an impact. But we'll go into that later. So these are some of the major neurotransmitters that we talk about in this unit. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin. Those are called monoamines. We have endorphins, enkephalins, and substance P. Those are called neuropeptides. Now, what I wanted to point out to you on the slide, though, is not so much the names of these. Some of them might be familiar to you. You probably heard of dopamine. You probably heard of serotonin. You probably have heard of epinephrine. If you know anybody who has an EpiPen, that's epinephrine. But I wanted to point out to you this monoamine and neuropeptide, because amine hopefully brings back some thoughts back to biology. Think amino. What this means is this is a single amino acid, monoamine. So these are essentially proteins, but a single amino acid. So they're not technically proteins because a protein is a chain of amino acids. Neuropeptides, similar scenario. These are small proteins made up of maybe 2, 3, 4 amino acids, and they're produced by these molecules. So why am I bringing this up? Well, if you remember, I mentioned that neurons have a lot of rough ER, and they're called Nissl bodies. That is why neurons have so many Nissl bodies. It's those rough ERs, those ribosomes. Neurons have to constantly be making neurotransmitters, which are essentially little proteins. They get made in the cell body, and they travel down those neurofibrils to the end of the axon, where they get released in the form of a neurotransmitter. So it all fits together. It is pretty cool. So let's just run through a couple of these more common ones. The first ones are called GABA and glutamate. These are the two most abundant neurotransmitters in the brain. I'm not going to talk too much about them, but just know those are the two most abundant. GABA is inhibitory and glutamate is excitatory. They're basically always at war in the sense that they're being released at different times, and if there's more GABA, it's going to prevent a neuron from firing off. If there's more glutamate, it's going to excite it. But those are just the two most common. The next one are epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're essentially the same molecule, two different forms of the same molecule. They do the same thing. They're hormones when they're released in your blood. They're actually released by your adrenal glands. These are more commonly known as adrenaline. That's epinephrine is adrenaline. It's the same thing. So if you've heard of adrenaline before, you know what it does, and that's exactly what it does here. But in the brain, it's a neurotransmitter. So in the nervous system, it's a neurotransmitter, and it stimulates the autonomic nervous system, which is the stuff that we don't control. It makes your heart rate go up, your breathing rate go up. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are what initiate what we call the fight or flight response. So if you've ever been yelled at before, or felt like you were being attacked, or even watched a scary movie, those responses that you have, those are a product of these hormones, and they make you ready to fight, essentially, or run. Dopamine is another very common neurotransmitter. It makes you feel good. This is the feel good one. That's why they call drugs dope. Drugs mimic the dopamine molecule, but this can be excitatory or inhibitory depending on what part of the brain it's in. But basically, it makes you feel good, and this is connected to actually Parkinson's disease. So in the part of the brain where dopamine is going to be, there's going to be a lot of it in the basal ganglia. We'll talk about that in the next unit. That if there's not enough dopamine there, that is actually linked to Parkinson's disease. So they're working on trying to come up with treatment options that deal with dopamine for people that have that disorder. And we'll talk more about that in the brain unit. Serotonin, another one you may be familiar with. Serotonin is really actually inhibitory, so it prevents a response. And if you don't have enough of it, it's actually linked to insomnia, where you can't fall asleep. So you see inhibitory, you think, oh, well, how would that wake you up? But the way the brain works, it is actually technically inhibitory. But serotonin also makes you feel good. So those two are kind of connected to that. And then endorphins, these are going to be, and enkephalins work similarly. These are inhibitory and they make you feel good. These also influence mood, and they actually are released during stress to block pain. So endorphins block pain. If you've ever heard of the term runner's high, that's an actual thing. If you run a far enough distance, your body starts to go under so much trauma, actually. Running's not that good for you over time because it does a lot of damage to your body, all that force coming up. So what ends up happening is pain starts to occur, and then your body produces endorphins, and they block those pain receptors. It's exactly what opiates do. It works the same way opiates do. The difference is an opiate, you're taking an artificial version of it, where endorphins, your body produces it. Unfortunately, that is how you can become addicted to opiates. And I'll talk more about that in class in just a discussion. And then finally, the last one is substance P. And substance P is actually the neurotransmitter that causes pain. That's what causes the sensation of pain. And pain's an interesting topic because it's different for everybody, and it's completely internal. Pain doesn't actually exist in the real world. It's 100% in your brain. That doesn't mean it's not real. People feel pain, but it's 100% produced by your own brain. And this is going to be excitatory, so your endorphins block it. Okay, that was a lot, so that's good enough for today. Thank you very much.